The first thing Dorothy Ellison remembered, later, was the sound of her husband's knees hitting the asphalt. Not his voice, not the officer's voice. The knees. A wet, hollow crack against the parking lot of Miller's Hardware on Route 9 at 4:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in October, with the sun still bright enough that the flashing blue and red lights looked almost decorative against the storefront glass. Walter Ellison was 72 years old. He had a titanium hip from a fall in 2019 and a heart that had been stented twice, once in 2017 and once in 2020. And Officer Dale Renner of the Millbrook Falls Police Department had just put him face down on the ground because Walter had, in Renner's words, made a move toward his waistband. A waistband that held nothing but a tucked-in flannel shirt and a belt his late father had given him in 1974, the leather worn soft and dark from 50 years of use. Dorothy screamed. Not a word. Just a sound that came from somewhere below language. The sound of a 68-year-old woman watching a stranger's knee press into her husband's spine on the ground outside a hardware store, in front of the lawn mowers and the bags of mulch stacked by the entrance, in front of the cashier who had come outside to see what the commotion was, in front of 9 or 10 strangers with their phones already rising like a small, silent congregation of witnesses. None of them knew, in that moment, that Walter and Dorothy Ellison's only son held the rank of Rear Admiral in the United States Navy, that he commanded Carrier Strike Group 11, that he had briefed members of the Senate Armed Services Committee 11 days earlier on Pacific Fleet readiness, or that within 72 hours, his voice, calm, exact, and utterly without mercy, would be the reason Millbrook Falls Police Department ceased to exist in its current form. They just saw an old black man on the ground, and a woman screaming his name, and 2 young officers who looked, for all the world, like they believed they were doing something righteous. Before we continue, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city and local time in the comments. I'm always amazed at how far these stories travel. To understand how a Tuesday afternoon errand for wood screws and a bag of grass seed turned into the end of careers, the beginning of a federal civil rights case, and eventually a change to policing policy across 3 states, you have to go back further than the parking lot. You have to go back to the house on Larchmont Drive, the one with the wraparound porch and the 2 rocking chairs that Walter had built himself in 1988, the year Marcus was born, out of pine he'd bought on discount from a lumber yard that no longer exists. Walter Ellison had worked for the United States Postal Service for 31 years, most of them walking the same 6-block route in the Eastwood neighborhood of Millbrook Falls, Georgia, a mid-sized town of about 41,000 people 40 minutes outside of Macon. He knew the name of every dog on his route. Biscuit, the arthritic beagle at 214 Cortlandt; Duke, the German shepherd at the Whitfield place, who'd bark himself hoarse and then lick Walter's hand through the fence; and the names of the children who grew up watching him deliver their birthday cards, sliding them through the slot with a little extra ceremony if he knew what day it was. He remembered which houses had a parent overseas and which houses to walk a little slower past on the 1st of the month, because the 1st of the month was when the Social Security checks came, and Miss Odessa Fontaine, 91 years old and living alone at 88 Larchmont, would be waiting on her porch swing just to have someone to talk to for 5 minutes. He retired in 2014 with a pension of $2,340 a month and a plaque from the Millbrook Falls Chamber of Commerce that still hung in the hallway, slightly crooked, because Dorothy liked it that way. Said it gave the house character, said a house without a crooked frame somewhere in it wasn't a house that had been properly lived in. Dorothy had spent 26 years teaching 3rd grade at Eastwood Elementary, the same school 2 blocks from their house, in room 14, with the reading corner she'd built out of a broken bookshelf and a beanbag chair she'd bought at a yard sale in 1998, and never replaced because the kids loved it too much to let her. She was the kind of teacher who kept protein bars in her desk drawer for the kids who came to school hungry, who bought school supplies out of her own paycheck every August without telling anyone, who once drove 11 miles to a boy's house at 10 o'clock at night because his mother had called the school in a panic. No gas money, no way to get him to a doctor for a fever that wouldn't break, and Dorothy had simply gotten in her car. She was still, at 68, running into grown men and women at the Piggly Wiggly who called her Mrs. Ellison, with something like reverence in their voices, grown men who'd tell their own children, standing right there in the cereal aisle, "This is the woman who taught me how to read." They had one child, Marcus Walter Ellison, born in 1976, the year of the bicentennial, which Walter liked to joke made him America's problem now. Marcus had been a serious boy, quiet, the kind of kid who read the World Book Encyclopedia for fun, front to back, and organized his G.I. Joes by rank before he understood what rank meant, arranging them along his windowsill in strict hierarchical order and getting genuinely upset if his cousin Dwayne rearranged them during a visit. He played trumpet in the Eastwood Middle School band, badly, for 2 years, before admitting to his parents that he hated it and wanted to quit, a confession Walter still brought up at family dinners, delighted, because it was one of the only times in Marcus's whole childhood that the boy had ever admitted to failing at something. He'd gotten a scholarship track appointment to the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis in 1994, the first person from Millbrook Falls in a generation to go there, sponsored in part by a letter of recommendation from his high school physics teacher, Mr. Aldous Greer, who'd written that Marcus possessed the rarest combination I have encountered in 30 years of teaching: total discipline paired with total humility. Walter had driven the 12 hours up in his 1987 Ford pickup just to watch him walk through the gates on induction day, standing at the edge of the crowd in his one good suit, navy blue, bought for his own father's funeral 8 years earlier and worn only twice since, crying without any shame at all while Dorothy squeezed his hand and told him to stop before he embarrassed the boy, though she was crying too. 29 years later, Marcus Ellison held the rank of Rear Admiral, lower half, the youngest black officer in the modern Navy to command a full carrier strike group. He had served in the Gulf during 2 deployments, in the Pacific during a tour that earned him a Legion of Merit, in briefing rooms in Washington, where men twice his age deferred to his assessments on carrier readiness and fleet posture. He called his parents every Sunday at 6 p.m. sharp, no matter what ocean he was on, no matter what time zone stood between him and Larchmont Drive, a habit he'd maintained without a single missed week since his plebe year at Annapolis. He had not been able to make it home for his father's birthday that October. A deployment cycle had him at sea, and the guilt of that had been sitting on him for 2 weeks straight, a small stone he carried in his chest that he mentioned to no one, not even his executive officer, who knew him better than almost anyone alive. His parents, for their part, never mentioned his rank to anyone in Millbrook Falls. Not out of shame, the opposite. Walter kept a framed photo of Marcus in his dress whites on the mantel, right beside the wedding photo and the picture of Dorothy's late mother, and told anyone who asked that his son was in the Navy, does some kind of leadership thing. Dorothy had a magnet on the refrigerator that said, "My son is a U.S. Navy officer," faded from the sun through the kitchen window. But they had lived in Millbrook Falls their entire lives as exactly what they were: a retired mail carrier and a retired school teacher, an old black couple who went to First Baptist on Sundays and Miller's Hardware on Tuesdays, who tended a small garden of tomatoes and okra along the side fence, who were, in the eyes of most of the town, simply Walter and Dorothy. Nobody's threat, nobody's headline, just 2 people who had spent 50 years quietly holding a community together in ways nobody kept official records of. Now that you've met Walter and Dorothy, I have to ask, does their story hit close to home? Have you known someone like them, the quiet ones who built a whole life out of small kindnesses nobody ever thanked them for out loud? Tell me about them in the comments. That Tuesday had been ordinary until it wasn't. Walter needed screws for a shelf he was building in the garage, a gift for Dorothy's growing collection of preserves, which had overtaken the pantry to the point that jars of muscadine jelly and pickled okra were now stacked on the floor of the hallway closet. And Dorothy had come along for grass seed, because the bald patch by the mailbox had been bothering her since August, ever since the county had dug it up to fix a water line and never properly restored the sod. They'd taken Walter's truck, the newer one, a 2019 Silverado, dark silver, license plate GDX 4471, and parked in the third space from the entrance, the way Walter always did, close enough to the cart return that he didn't have to walk far with his hip. It should have taken them 15 minutes. It should have been screws, grass seed, and a stop at the register, where the cashier, a 19-year-old named Brianna Estes, would ring them up same as always, ask about Marcus, and send them on their way with a "Y'all have a blessed evening," the way she did every single Tuesday, because Walter and Dorothy had become something like regulars, something like neighbors. In the year and a half Brianna had worked the front register. Instead, at 4:31 p.m., a silver Honda Accord had been reported stolen from a Waffle House parking lot 11 miles away, in the neighboring town of Cordon. The description that went out over dispatch was vague to the point of uselessness. Dark-colored SUV or truck, possibly driven by a black male, last seen heading east on Route 9. The kind of description that, if you were being honest about it, matched roughly 4,000 vehicles and 40% of the male population within a 20-mile radius. It did not match a 2019 silver Silverado driven by a 72-year-old man with a cane resting against the passenger seat and a "Support Our Troops" sticker in the back window. Officer Dale Renner, 26 years old, 18 months on the force, was 3 blocks away when the call came in, finishing a slow patrol lap past the elementary school. His training officer, Kyle Buford, 24, 11 months on the force, was riding with him that shift, a decision that would later be scrutinized in an internal affairs report, since neither officer had more than 2 years of field experience, and both were, by the department's own use of force review board, still developing threat assessment judgment, a phrase that would appear 11 times in the eventual 340-page investigation. Renner pulled into the Miller's hardware lot behind the Silverado at 4:44 p.m., 3 minutes after Walter and Dorothy had parked and gone inside. He ran the plate. The plate did not match the stolen vehicle report. A different make, a different color, a different state of registration entirely. Renner would later claim in his written statement that the system was slow to return results and that he made a judgment call based on the totality of circumstances. The totality of circumstances, as captured on the store's exterior security camera and later on 4 separate cell phone videos, was this: an elderly black man in a flannel shirt walking out of a hardware store carrying a small paper bag of wood screws, his wife beside him carrying a bag of grass seed, walking toward a truck that Renner had already run and cleared before either of them had even stepped outside. At 4:46 p.m., Renner exited his cruiser with his hand on his holster and shouted for Walter to "stop and show me your hands." Walter Ellison, who had never in his life had a physical confrontation with a police officer, who had voted in every election since 1972, who had a Chamber of Commerce plaque in his hallway and a wall of thank you cards from students of Dorothy's tucked in a drawer he never threw away, stopped, turned, and said, "Officer, is there a problem? This is my truck. I've got the registration right here in the glove box." The word glove box was, according to Buford's later statement, the trigger. Walter had gestured, a small, natural motion of the hand, the kind anyone makes when explaining where a document is kept, and Buford, standing behind Renner, called out, "He's reaching!" There was no reaching. There was a 72-year-old man explaining where his registration was, the same gesture he'd made 100 times at 100 routine traffic stops over 50 years of driving. none of which had ever once ended this way. Renner closed the distance in 4 steps and grabbed Walter's left arm to pull it behind his back. Walter, startled, off balance, his bad hip buckling under the sudden torque, said, "Wait, sir, my hip, please, I've got a hip replacement." And it was at that moment, 9 seconds after Renner first shouted, that Dorothy Ellison began screaming her husband's name, the bag of grass seed dropping from her hand and splitting open across the pavement. Dorothy tried to move toward them, and Buford put his arm out and told her, "Ma'am, step back now," in a voice that Dorothy would later describe, under oath, as the kind of voice you use on a dog, not a person. She did not step back fast enough for Buford's satisfaction, and he took her by the shoulder and pushed her. Not hard, not violently by any legal definition that would later matter in court, but enough that a 68-year-old woman stumbled sideways into a display of bagged mulch, catching herself on the edge of a shelf, grass seed scattering across the asphalt in a small green fan that a Miller's hardware employee would later be photographed sweeping up, long after it mattered. By the time the 3rd minute had passed, Walter Ellison was face down on the asphalt of the Miller's hardware parking lot, his hands cuffed behind his back, his cheek pressed against the ground, his breathing audibly ragged, saying, over and over, in a voice that cracked with something between fear and disbelief, "I have a heart condition. I have a heart condition. Please, I have a heart condition." Renner's response, captured clearly on Brianna Estes' cell phone video, which would be viewed 14 million times in the following 9 days, was, "You should have thought about that before you resisted." Walter had not resisted. He had asked a question about his registration and made a hand gesture toward a glove box. The plate came back clean at 4:52 p.m., 6 minutes after Walter Ellison hit the ground. By then, a small crowd had gathered. Brianna, who had come outside the moment she heard Dorothy scream and stood frozen for a moment before pulling out her phone. A mother named Colleen Ruiz with 2 kids in a shopping cart, one of whom began crying at the sight of the flashing lights. An off-duty firefighter named Gerald Toms, 41 years old, who had just finished loading a bag of concrete mix into his own truck 2 rows over and would later become one of the case's most important witnesses. And Dorothy Ellison, on her knees now beside her husband, having pushed past Buford's outstretched arm the second his grip loosened, her hand on Walter's shoulder, saying his name in a voice that had gone from a scream to something quieter and far more devastating. The sound of a woman trying to hold her husband together with words because her hands weren't allowed to touch him the way she needed to. "Walter, baby, look at me. Breathe. Just breathe. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." They did not uncuff him until 4:58 p.m., 14 minutes after Renner had first shouted for him to stop. By then, Walter's lips had gone gray around the edges, and it was Gerald Toms, the off-duty firefighter, who pushed past the officers and said, flatly, in the calm, procedural voice of a man trained to speak clearly during emergencies, "This man needs an ambulance right now, not a citation. I'm a firefighter, I'm certified EMT, let me get to him," and began checking Walter's pulse himself while Renner stood a few feet away, radio in hand, finally, calling it in. "After what Renner and Buford just did to Walter and Dorothy, I need to hear your reaction. What would you have done in that moment? Drop it in the comments." Walter Ellison spent that night in Millbrook Falls Regional Medical Center. Not, mercifully, from a heart attack, the cardiologist on call, Dr. Priya Anand, would later testify that the stress of the encounter had triggered atrial fibrillation, a dangerous but non-fatal arrhythmia, and that another 5 minutes on that pavement, at his age, with his cardiac history, could plausibly have been fatal. He was released the next morning with a bruised hip, 2 cracked ribs from the leg sweep, and a diagnosis of acute stress reaction that his doctor documented carefully, in writing. for reasons that would matter enormously in the weeks to come. No citation was ever issued. There was, after all, nothing to cite him for. The stolen Honda Accord was recovered that same evening, 40 minutes away, driven by a 22-year-old man named Devon Ashford, with no connection whatsoever to Walter Ellison, his truck, or Millbrook Falls, arrested without incident in a gas station parking lot in Cordon. The Ellisons' neighbors began showing up at the hospital before visiting hours were even fully underway the next morning. Miss Odessa Fontaine, 91, sent her granddaughter with a casserole. The pastor of First Baptist, Reverend Cornell Whitby, sat with Dorothy in the waiting room for 2 hours the first night, saying almost nothing, simply being present, which Dorothy would later say was exactly the kind of prayer I needed. Word moved through Eastwood the way it always had, house to house, porch to porch, faster than any headline. Walter Ellison, the mailman everybody knew, on the ground in a parking lot, and Dorothy pushed into a shelf of mulch, and nobody in that town, in those first hours, had any idea it would go further than a very bad afternoon and a very angry neighborhood. Dorothy called Marcus that night from the hospital waiting room, her hands shaking so badly she had to try the number twice. It was 11 p.m. Eastern, which put Marcus somewhere in the mid-Pacific, 11 hours ahead, standing on the flag bridge of the USS Corwin Vale during a routine underway period. He had a satellite phone reserved for family emergencies, a privilege of rank that he had never once had to use for anything more urgent than his father's gallbladder surgery in 2021. Dorothy's voice, when he answered, did not sound like his mother's voice. It sounded thin and far away, even accounting for the distance, and it took her 3 tries to get the sentence out whole. "Marcus, baby, they put your father on the ground, in the parking lot, at Miller's. They had him face down and he couldn't breathe right and I couldn't. They wouldn't let me near him, Marcus. They wouldn't let me touch him." Marcus Ellison had briefed 2-star admirals without his pulse rising above 65. He had commanded a flight deck during a man-overboard emergency with a voice so level his junior officers used it as a training example years later. But standing on that bridge at nearly midnight local time, phone pressed so hard to his ear it left a mark. Listening to his mother's voice break apart in real time from 4,000 miles away, he felt something in his chest go cold and very, very still. "Is Dad stable?" he said. Not a question. A demand for information, the only thing he could control from that distance. "He's stable. They're keeping him overnight. His heart did something," the doctor said. "Marcus, I have never in my life been so scared. I need you to do something for me, Mom. I need you to not delete anything. Any videos people took, any names, any badge numbers you can remember. Can you do that for me?" Yes, baby, I can do that. I'm coming home." He hung up, and for exactly 40 seconds, Rear Admiral Marcus Ellison stood alone on the flag bridge of a United States aircraft carrier and did not move. Then he called his chief of staff, Captain Renee Alvarez, informed her he required emergency leave transfer under the family hardship provision, and began the process of doing what 31 hours later would become the single most consequential arrival of his father's life. Right now, Marcus Ellison is about to make a move that changes everything. Before I tell you what he did, what would your next move be? Tell me in the comments. It took Marcus 31 hours to get from mid-Pacific waters to Millbrook Falls Regional Medical Center, a helicopter transfer to Guam, a military flight to Travis Air Force Base, a commercial connection through Atlanta that he spent entirely on the phone, first with his parents' civilian attorney, a Millbrook Falls solo practitioner named Thomas Riggs, who handled mostly wills and property disputes, and was, by his own admission on a later news segment, completely out of his depth on something like this, and knew it within the first 5 minutes of hearing the details. And then, with a former Naval Academy classmate, now a partner at a civil rights litigation firm in Atlanta named Colette Duvernay, who agreed to take the case the moment Marcus described what the cell phone footage showed. He arrived at the hospital at 9:14 p.m. on Wednesday, still in his travel uniform, having not slept more than 90 consecutive minutes in over a day. He did not go to the police station first. He went to his father. Walter was sitting up in bed, color mostly returned, an oxygen cannula still looped under his nose, watching a rerun of a baseball game with the sound off. When he saw Marcus in the doorway, something in his face, a 72-year-old man who had spent his whole life being careful, being quiet, being twice as good and asking for half as much, broke open, just slightly, at the edges. "You didn't have to come all this way, son." "Dad!" Marcus crossed the room and took his father's hand, the same hand that had once handed him a suitcase at the gates of Annapolis. "I would have swum here." Dorothy, asleep in the recliner in the corner, woke at the sound of his voice and was across the room in 3 steps, and for a long moment none of them said anything at all, the 3 of them simply holding on to each other in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and hospital coffee, while outside, 40 miles away in Cordon, a cell phone video of Walter Ellison's arrest had already been shared 6,000 times and was climbing. Marcus did not raise his voice once during the 11 days that followed. This would become, in retrospect, one of the most quietly devastating facts of the entire case, that a man with every right to fury conducted himself with a discipline that made the eventual reckoning land with far more force than rage ever could have. On Thursday morning, with his father discharged and resting at home, Marcus sat at the kitchen table on Larchmont Drive, with Colette Duvernay on speakerphone, and began building the case with the same methodical patience he brought to Fleet Logistics. He requested, through Duvernay, in writing, by certified mail, with a copy hand-delivered by a Millbrook Falls process server that same afternoon, the full body camera footage from both officers, the dispatch audio, the CAD report timestamps, and the officers' complete disciplinary histories, citing Georgia's open record statute. The department, through its attorney, initially resisted, citing an ongoing internal review. Duvernay responded within 6 hours with a formal notice of intent to sue under Section 1983 of the Federal Civil Rights Code, and the footage was released the following afternoon, Friday, at 2 p.m. It was, by every account, worse than the cell phone videos had suggested. The body camera audio captured Buford, off-mic to what he believed was a private aside to Renner while Walter lay cuffed on the ground, saying, "Man's probably got warrants somewhere. They always do." No warrants existed. No criminal record existed. Walter Ellison's most serious prior legal encounter was a parking ticket in 2009, which he had paid the same week it was issued. Marcus watched the footage 3 times, alone, in his childhood bedroom, sitting on the same twin bed he'd slept in as a boy, the World Book Encyclopedia volumes still lined up on the shelf above the desk. He did not cry. He took notes, in a small green notebook he'd carried since his first command, timestamps and quotes, building what would become, in effect, the opening argument of a public reckoning that hadn't happened yet. That Friday afternoon, the Millbrook Falls City Council called an emergency public session in response to mounting community pressure and a march of nearly 400 residents down Route 9 that had shut down traffic for 2 hours, organized in less than a day by Reverend Whitby and a coalition of Eastwood families who had, it turned out, been quietly documenting complaints against the department for years without anywhere to bring them. Marcus decided, after a long conversation with his parents at the kitchen table, that the moment called for something the town could not misread, could not spin, could not quietly manage. His parents had asked him, gently, if he could just help as their son, worried about drawing attention, worried in the particular way that black parents of a certain generation worry about visibility itself becoming a liability. Marcus understood the worry. He decided to accept the risk anyway. He walked into the Millbrook Falls Municipal Building at 6:58 p.m. that Friday in his full Navy dress uniform, 2 silver stars on each shoulder board, catching the fluorescent light, and sat down in the front row of the packed council chamber next to his mother, who wore her Sunday dress and held her husband's hand, while Walter sat in a wheelchair the hospital had insisted on for the evening, still tender from the cracked ribs. Police Chief Roy Tackett, 48 years old, 22 years with the department, 6 as chief, had prepared a statement that afternoon defending his officers' split-second decision-making under uncertain circumstances. He had not, according to 3 separate accounts from council staff, been informed in advance who exactly would be sitting in that front row. When public comment opened, Marcus Ellison stood, and the room went, by every witness account, entirely silent. "My name is Marcus Ellison," he said, his voice even, carrying without effort to the back of the chamber. "I hold the rank of Rear Admiral in the United States Navy. I currently command Carrier Strike Group 11. 11 days ago, I was briefing members of the United States Senate on force readiness in the Pacific Theater. 4 days ago, I was standing on the bridge of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier when my mother called to tell me that 2 officers of this department had put my 72-year-old father, a decorated 31-year employee of the United States Postal Service, face down on a parking lot pavement, ignored his statement that he had a cardiac condition, kept him restrained for 14 minutes past the point where the vehicle in question had already been cleared, and referred to my mother, in the words of your own body camera audio, in a manner I will not repeat in front of children in this room. He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds, long enough, Chief Tackett would later admit in a deposition, for it to feel like a year. "I am not here tonight as an admiral," Marcus continued. "I put this uniform on for one reason, and it is not the one you think. I did not put it on to remind this room of my rank. I put it on because I wanted every person watching to understand something plainly. My father was not less worthy of dignity 10 minutes before I walked through that door than he is right now. Nothing about him changed. The only thing that changed is that now you know who I am. And if the only thing standing between my father being humiliated on the ground and my father being treated like a human being is the rank on my collar, then this department has already told you everything you need to know about what it actually believes about the people it is sworn to protect." He continued for several more minutes, laying out the timeline, with the precision of a man used to briefing officers who would act on his every word. The 6 minutes between the plate clearing and the handcuffs coming off. The 14 minutes his father spent restrained after stating a cardiac condition. The 9 prior citizen complaints the department had, by that point, already confirmed to a local reporter it had on file. He closed by turning, for the only time that evening, from the council dais to the gallery behind him. "To the people of Eastwood, who have been telling this council for years that something was wrong with how this department treats you. I believe you. I have always believed you. I just happen to be standing here tonight in a uniform that makes it harder for anyone in this room to pretend they don't." The clip of that statement, 11 minutes and 40 seconds, uncut, filmed by a local news affiliate that had shown up expecting a routine council dispute, would be picked up by 3 national networks within 18 hours and viewed, across platforms, more than 40 million times within a week. Marcus's voice was finally heard. "But here's what I want to know. Have you ever had a moment where you stood your ground and the truth finally came out? Share that story in the comments. Someone watching needs to hear it." What followed moved faster than anyone in Millbrook Falls, a town whose city council usually deliberated for months over zoning variances, had ever seen local government move. Within 48 hours of the council meeting, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation opened an independent inquiry, a step triggered in part by a formal request from the office of Georgia's U.S. Senator, whose staff had, it emerged, personally worked with Marcus during his Senate testimony 11 days earlier, and recognized his name the moment the footage went national. The U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division opened a parallel pattern or practice review of the Millbrook Falls Police Department 5 days after that, citing not only the Ellison incident, but 9 prior citizen complaints against the department over the preceding 4 years, 7 of which involved black residents and had been closed, according to the DOJ's preliminary findings, without documented corrective action. Officer Dale Renner was placed on unpaid administrative leave within 72 hours of the council meeting and formally terminated 11 days later, following the conclusion of the GBI's initial review, which found his use of force report materially inconsistent with the body camera footage in at least 4 specific respects, including his claim that Walter had made an aggressive gesture toward his waistband, a claim the footage directly contradicted. Officer Kyle Buford was terminated the same day. The review cited both his physical contact with Dorothy Ellison and his recorded remark about Walter's supposed warrants as evidence of conduct unbecoming and a pattern of assumption inconsistent with departmental training standards. Chief Roy Tackett resigned 19 days after the incident, under pressure from the City Council and, by his own account in his resignation letter, in recognition that the department requires leadership untethered to the culture that allowed this to occur. His departure came 2 days after an internal audit, ordered by the interim city manager, revealed that Millbrook Falls PD had not conducted mandatory de-escalation refresher training for any officer, including supervisors, in over 3 years, despite state requirements, a lapse that would become central to the eventual federal consent decree. Colette Duvernay filed a federal civil rights lawsuit on behalf of Walter and Dorothy Ellison 6 weeks after the incident, naming the city of Millbrook Falls, the Millbrook Falls Police Department, Renner, and Buford as defendants, alleging excessive force, false imprisonment, and violation of Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable seizure. Thomas Riggs, the family's original attorney, stayed on as local counsel throughout, and would later say that watching Duvernay work was the best legal education I never paid for. The city's insurer settled 8 months later for $475,000, along with a formal written apology delivered in person by the newly appointed interim police chief, a 20-year veteran named Chief Adele Marsh, brought in from a department 40 miles away specifically for her record on community policing reform. But the settlement, notably, was not the part of the outcome that Marcus Ellison had pushed hardest for. In the weeks between the council meeting and the lawsuit's filing, he had spent almost every evening on the phone, not with news outlets, all of whom wanted him, but with the interim city manager, with Chief Marsh before she was even hired, with the DOJ's civil rights investigators, pressing always for the same thing, not a payout, but a rebuild. My father doesn't want your money as much as he wants the next 72-year-old man in this town to be able to walk out of a hardware store without a paper bag of screws being mistaken for a weapon, he told a national news anchor during one of the only interviews he agreed to give, 3 weeks after the incident, sitting beside his father in the living room on Larchmont Drive, Walter's hand resting on the arm of his recliner, mostly healed, still careful about how he moved. Money closes a case file. It does not change a department's culture. I have spent my career being told that leadership is about the systems you leave behind, not the headlines you generate in the moment. I'd like this department to actually be better in 5 years. That's the only outcome I care about. 9 months after the incident, the Department of Justice's Pattern or Practice Review concluded with a formal consent decree agreed to by the city of Millbrook Falls without contest. It mandated a complete overhaul of use-of-force reporting standards, an independent citizen review board with subpoena power over excessive force complaints, mandatory quarterly de-escalation and implicit bias training for every sworn officer, a body camera activation policy with automatic disciplinary review for any lapse, and, at Marcus's specific and repeated request, delivered through Duvernay in writing to the DOJ negotiating team, a community advisory council with a permanent seat reserved for a representative of Eastwood, the historically black neighborhood Walter had walked as a mail carrier for 31 years. Two Millbrook Falls City Council members who had initially defended the officer's conduct lost their seats in the following spring's election to challengers who ran, almost entirely, on the promise of police accountability reform. Brianna Estes, the 19-year-old cashier whose cell phone video had started it all, was invited by Chief Marsh to sit on the very citizen review board the consent decree created, becoming, at 20, its youngest member. Gerald Toms, the off-duty firefighter, was later honored by the city council for his conduct that day, an award he accepted with visible discomfort, telling the room, "I didn't do anything except the bare minimum of what a person should do for another person. It shouldn't be an award. It should just be normal." Officer Dale Renner and Officer Kyle Buford both had their law enforcement certifications formally revoked by the Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council the following year, a decision that effectively barred either man from working as a police officer anywhere in the state again. Full consequences and systemic change intertwined. That's the shape this story ultimately took. Walter Ellison turned 73 the following March. Marcus made it home for the birthday that year, no deployment cycle standing in the way, and the party was held on the porch on Larchmont Drive, the same porch with the rocking chairs Walter had built in 1988, strung now with lights that Dorothy had insisted on even though it wasn't Christmas, because, she said, the man deserves lights. Half of Eastwood showed up. Gerald Toms brought a smoker and did the ribs, refusing to let anyone else touch the grill. Brianna Estes came by after her review board meeting, still in her work polo, hugged Dorothy for a full 30 seconds without saying anything, and left with a plate of cobbler Dorothy made her promise to bring the dish back for. Chief Adele Marsh stopped by for 20 minutes, out of uniform, just to shake Walter's hand and tell him, quietly, that she'd read every page of the consent decree twice and intended to hold every officer in her department to it, starting with herself. Reverend Whitby said grace over the food and, in the middle of it, without quite meaning to, started listing off the names of everyone who'd shown up in that council chamber the night it mattered, until Dorothy had to gently touch his arm and remind him the ribs were getting cold. Walter still walks with a slight hitch in his step from the hip, more pronounced now than it was before that October afternoon, a fact his doctors attribute partly to the leg sweep and partly, simply, to time. He still goes to Miller's Hardware. He went back 4 days after being released from the hospital, before the council meeting, before any of it had gone national, walked in on his cane, bought the same brand of wood screws, and finished the shelf for Dorothy's preserves that same weekend. When people ask him why he went back so soon, he says the same thing every time. "That store didn't do anything to me. A couple of scared young men made a bad call. I wasn't about to let 2 people take a whole town away from me." Dorothy retired her teaching materials for good that year, but still keeps the magnet on the refrigerator. "My son is a U.S. Navy officer. A little more faded now, joined recently by a second one, a gift from Marcus's staff, that says, 'Grandparents of an Admiral,' which Dorothy insists is excessive, but has never once taken down. Marcus Ellison still calls every Sunday at 6 p.m. sharp, no matter the ocean, no matter the time zone. He still commands his strike group. He does not talk about the incident often in professional settings, though he has, twice, been asked to speak to Navy leadership cohorts about what he calls the discipline of restraint, the idea that the loudest, most permanent kind of authority is often the quietest kind, the kind that waits, that gathers facts, that does not need to shout to be heard. He keeps one thing on his desk aboard ship that has nothing to do with the Navy at all, a small framed photograph of his parents on that porch, taken the night of Walter's 73rd birthday, string lights glowing behind them, his father's hand resting easy on the arm of a rocking chair he built himself 35 years earlier, his mother laughing at something just out of frame. Marcus looks at it most mornings before his first briefing of the day, a reminder, he says, of the only rank that ever actually mattered to him, the rank of being their son. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever watched someone you love be underestimated right up until the moment the truth came out, tell me about it in the comments below. Every voice deserves to be heard, and I'd love to hear yours.